ญาติโยมชาวไทยเรานะตอนนี้ก็ฝึกปฏิบัติธรรมโดยการตั้งสตินะฟังหลวงพ่อเขมธรรมโมนี่ฟังไม่รู้เรื่องก็ฟังไปเรื่อยๆตั้งสติดูใจก็ได้ดูใจเราไปเรื่อยๆนะมันเกิดอะไรขึ้นในใจก็สังเกตไปดูไปนะนั่นแหละเพราะว่าท่านเทศภาษาอังกฤษอย่างเดียวเท่านั้นนะดังนั้นแต่ว่าชาวต่างชาติชาวต่างประเทศนะก็จะฟังสบายเพราะว่าท่านเทศภาษาอังกฤษนะส่วนคนไทยเราก็เป็นโอกาสที่จะได้ฝึกสตินะฝึกสติรับฟังไปเรื่อยๆนะดูใจไปหรือว่ารับฟังตั้งสติว่าท่านพูดยังไงบ้าง เสียงท่านออกมายังไงแล้วก็ฟังไปอย่างนั้นเท่านั้นนะไม่ต้องปรุงแต่งนะไม่ต้องปรุงแต่งว่าท่านเทศว่ายังไงอยากจะฟังรู้เรื่องก็ไม่ต้องอยากไม่อยากฟังก็ไม่ต้องไม่อยาก คือฟังไปเรื่อยๆฟังไปเรื่อยๆนี่เป็นการประพฤติปฏิบัติธรรมที่หลวงปู่ท่านเน้นหลวงพ่อเจ้าคุณพระเทวราชาท่านก็บอกอยู่แล้วเมื่อกี้นี้นะการตั้งสติก็ทำได้ทุกรูปแบบอย่างนี้แหละนะการฟังก็เป็นการตั้งสติเหมือนกันท่านก็อยู่รุ่นแรกๆเหมือนกันหลวงพ่อเขมธรรมโมตอนนี้ท่านก็นั่งเรียบร้อยแล้วพวกเราก็กราบ
นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ This is going to be very difficult for many of you here because I've been asked to speak English, which is a good idea because I'm English and I don't speak very good Thai. It's been a very long time since I lived in Thailand, and I wouldn't wish to inflict my very imperfect Thai on your delicate ears. So I hope at the end of this, someone will give you some idea about what I've said, and I hope that some of you will understand me. It's going to be a funny experience talking like this to, I know, many people who will have no idea what I'm saying. When I first came to Thailand, of course, and the many years that I spent here, I didn't speak Thai at all. And so I've sat through thousands of hours, I should think, of conversations and dhammadesanas and so on and so forth, of which I've understood practically nothing. I remember when I first came, I came to Ubon on the 1st of January 1972, and I came to join Wat Pa Pong soon after that. And at Marga Puja we had to go to Wat Tam Sang Pet because the big sala on the top of the hill was being offered, and we had 3 nights of sitting up all night. I'd never done such a thing, of course, and we had to sit through long dhammadesanas. I understood nothing at all, but it was quite spectacular. And I remember particularly listening to the sounds of the Isan language. Now, all I can remember, I was fascinated by this sort of music of which was wonderful. I didn't have a clue what was being said, but it sounded great. So maybe, well, I hope this will sound great to you, even if you can't understand it. When I come back now every year, it's of course a time when my mind is flooded with memories, not all of it which are very pleasant, I must say, because life as a monk, especially when you come here nearly 50 years ago, it was quite different and it was quite difficult and tough sometimes. And I'd led a very different life. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into when I came here. And I found myself having to cope with several changes: climate, food, language, culture, all sorts. A bit more than I realized I was taking on, I think. But, one of the things that we were taught over and over again was to endure. I remember Luang Por Chah saying, there's nothing to it, just endure, just be patient. And it always, when I think about that, of course strikes me first as being a bit sort of macho and tough, but also very true. Because when you just manage to sit through things, you do learn quite a lot. It makes you stronger, and you can't help but observe changes taking place in yourself and in your mind. And that's, in the end, of great benefit to you. You don't always realize these things at the time, but as time passes, you recognize that there is some growth, at least in your experience of life, and if not perhaps necessarily in your profound wisdom. I remember my first day and night here, because it was very different, I mean, here now it's so prosperous, this wonderful sala, thousands of people, all lit up with electricity. And back then there was no electricity here. The sala was not a very inspiring building, I can tell you. And there weren't that many people. My first night, I ventured out of the kuti they'd given me in the dark, searching for the kuti of another Farang monk who'd invited me to go to his place for a cup of tea. I hadn't gone many yards when there was this kind of snorting coming through the undergrowth. I thought to myself, well, I'm sure there's nothing dangerous, no dangerous animals here. They would have told me. So I ploughed on for a little while, but this snorting grew louder and louder, and in the end I retreated back to my kuti. I discovered next day it was one of the porcupines that had been released here. And then my first day, the first meal, I went on a very long bindapat, and then I was instructed in what to do at the meal. And that was different then. Nowadays, there are buffet tables set up, and monks can go and pick and choose what they would like to eat from what's on offer. But it wasn't like that in those days. We used to sit there, and I was told to sit behind my bowl and just watch my bowl and watch my mind. So that's what we used to do. We used to sit there and patiently just watch the bowl, and a few monks would go along the line and slop curry and various bits and pieces into our bowl, and we were simply supposed to just observe that and observe what it did to our minds. I remember vividly, and it was probably a couple of years into my time here, when I was sitting there patiently behind my bowl one morning, and the usual not terribly to me, I'm afraid, appetizing things were being dumped in my bowl. And then suddenly I saw this great block of ice cream fall into my bowl. I hadn't seen anything like it for, well, it felt like years. And the excitement sort of grew in my mind. But it didn't last very long because suddenly there was a great slop of goopy curry and I never saw the ice cream again. But that's what it was like. You had to observe and observe what it did to your mind. The excitement and then, of course, the disappointment. And we were back to a day of normal Isan food, which I must say, and I always think about this, however unappetizing it was always given with great generosity. And of course, no one had invited me here. I just came and I was accepted and looked after. And that was really quite incredible when I think back on it, that people here have been so willing to take people like myself, coming from a prosperous background and country, and look after us with great care and generosity. I, like many of my generation, and we were all young, you see, in those days. I was 27 when I came here, and now I'm a good bit older than that. And I still feel 27, but I clearly am not. But we were all young, and I think back on those memories. The inspiration behind this place, of course, was Luang Por Chah. I had heard of him before I came here. I didn't know anything about him. And I remember being a bit frustrated when I had arrived and been here for a little while, because I couldn't really quite figure out what was so special about him. I could see that the place, the way it was set up, was a very useful place to be. I could see it had been set up as a place where one could work on one's mind and develop oneself. So I thought to myself, well, that's all right. I'd been practicing Buddhism for some time in England. I thought I knew a bit. And this is what I wanted to do. Of course, as time passed, I began to discover a bit more about Luang Por Chah. I was a bit put off to begin with, you see, because my previous career had been in the theatre. I'd been an actor, and I'd been in what's called the Royal National Theatre of England. And in those days, amongst us, there was a bit of resistance to what is known as the star system. And my generation were very concerned about overcoming that to some extent and enabling the work we were doing, the plays, to speak for themselves without being dominated by one or two persons. And when I came here, I walked into what I couldn't help but see as a star system, and that put me off a bit to begin with. But anyway, as time went on, I could see that this man, Luang Por Chah, was rather special. And particularly, he was a person of enormous loving kindness. He could be pretty fierce. And I can tell you, when you were told off by Luang Por Chah, you knew it. There's still things that I remember vividly, because I was told off a few times. And when you were told off by Luang Por Chah, you weren't only told off by him, but you were told off in front of an audience, which made it that much more severe. So he wasn't always the sort of jolly elderly man that I think people often think of him as being. He could be quite harsh, quite tough. But I could take that. That was all right. I managed that. But still, I could see that there was this, beneath it all, a tremendous loving kindness and compassion. And I gradually warmed to this to his the power of his personality. Then I had the good fortune to go with him to England. He was invited to London, and he was invited to stay at the Hamster Buddhist Vihara, which was where I first discovered Buddhism. I used to live in that area and often go past the Hamster Buddhist Vihara. I was a student at a drama school very close to the Hamster Buddhist Vihara, and later on, after I'd left, when I was no longer a student, I used to live in that area. So it was very familiar territory to me, and I was very proud, really, to be taking Luang Por Chah there, into that part of the world. And of course, then, over those 2 months, I had very close contact with him. Here, it was always a bit difficult because there were always so many people around him. You couldn't ever get him on his own, or very rarely. But over those 2 months in England, I had pretty much unlimited access to him, and that was tremendous. I took him to my parents. And this is something that I think is not very well known about Luang Por Chah. I don't see it in the things that have been written about him, nor do I hear much about it nowadays. But he was, for quite long periods, a vegetarian. He would abstain from meat and fish, and he was very strict about it. And I remember when I took him to my parents, and my mother, who wasn't really much of a cook, I'm afraid, cooked some stuff for him and included a couple of sausages. And he very graciously accepted it all, but he wouldn't touch the sausages, he wouldn't touch the meat. And I remember at one stage he said even that he would never touch meat again. I think this is not very well known. I do hear from time to time monks talking a bit sort of negatively about vegetarianism. Because of course the Buddha, when he was asked by Devata to make a rule about abstention from meat, refused. And he refused because clearly Devadatta's request was not a pure one. And probably he also thought that for wandering mendicants it would be somewhat impractical. And I must confess, although I've been a vegetarian most of my life, yes, probably most of my life, I appreciate that I don't have to worry myself too much about whether what I've been given, a cake or whatever, has anything of animal in it. Later, in England, before I went to live where I am now, I was temporarily in a building on a farm where they have the largest slaughterhouse in the Midlands, in the middle part of England. And I had to go past this every day. And surrounding me were the fields in which they lodged the animals prior to killing them. And it was an extraordinary experience, really, living there, because you were surrounded by animals crying. They could smell what was in store for them. And I think everyone really ought to have that kind of insight into what goes on and what happens when you are meat eaters. In England, people are a bit surprised to see monks eating meat. They can't often put it together quite, how we will sit in places like this and give the precepts, the first one being, of course, to abstain from killing, and then happily accept meat or fish. The expectation generally is that monks, samanas, should be vegetarian. Nowadays there's an added incentive, of course, because we hear a lot in the West, and I don't know how much you know here, but a lot about climate change and concerns about how the human race has abused the planet, and we are in a state of crisis. A large part of Australia is on fire. England this winter has been unusually wet. It's rained almost constantly. Parts of the country have been flooded. And clearly something is happening. Quite big changes. And the people who know about these things, the scientists and so on, are telling us that something needs to be done quickly. But of course, nothing is being done, or very little, because, unfortunately, people are continuing to make money out of the very things which damage the planet. We're coming back to the age-old problem of greed and attachment. And you may remember that the Buddha was reluctant to speak after his enlightenment because he could see that the world, that people generally were obsessed with their attachments, enjoying their attachments, and not prepared really to do anything about challenging their habits and changing their ways. And so it's gone on. And we've seen things change enormously over the last 50 years. I said earlier when I was talking that this place was so different back then when I first came here 48 years ago. No electricity at all, no running water. There were just one or two pressure lanterns lit up. Occasionally, somewhere over there in a pit, an engine was cranked up to produce a few flickering lights, a little bit of electricity. But now look at it. And I observe too, in England, the expectations are that the houses have to be completely heated. The whole house, everyone's home, has to be heated from top to bottom. When I was young, and the winters were sometimes harsher than they are now, one room was heated. And then it was only heated from a coal fire in the evening. And the bedrooms were never heated, ever. But the expectation now is to have a much more easy life and to expend huge amounts of energy. Where's it all coming from? Think about it. And where's it all going to end? Because one day it's all going to run out. And certainly it's changing the planet. And people are very concerned. People are saying that things have got to change. But fundamentally, what they don't say, and what they don't realize perhaps, is that the greed and attachment is what has to change. If we are to save our planet, if we are to save our lives, if we are to free ourselves at all, we have to come back to the Buddha's basic message and do something about what goes on in our minds, and do something about giving up the greed and attachment. It's difficult, of course. The Buddha's practice is not an easy one, but it's a very extraordinary message. And it's a message which Luang Por Chah was particularly adept at expressing. Because, sometimes Buddhism seems to be somehow a little bit kind of out there. You read about it in the books, you can memorize the words, the Pali terms, the theories and all that stuff, and it's somehow just a little bit distant. It's good stuff, it's inspiring, and so on and so forth, but somehow it's not kind of applicable to me. It's a bit like, how we go through life knowing full well that we're stalked continuously by illness and old age and death, but it's somehow something that happens to other people. When it does happen to us, we're shocked, and sometimes people are quite angry and upset when they find themselves close to death or very, very ill, or someone who's dear to them has passed away. And the truths of Buddhism, for many people, are just a little bit out there, a little bit distant. Luang Por Chah's one of his great talents was waking people up to the fact that greed is in your mind, it's right here. He'd sit there under that kuti, day after day, patiently receiving people coming from all over the country. It was grueling, I can tell you. I mean, we had to wait on him. And I can remember in the heat of the day sitting there listening to the rubbish that people were talking to him about. Women complaining about their husbands, men complaining about their wives, all sorts of nonsense. And he patiently sat there listening to it hour after hour. But whenever there was an opportunity, he was like a master swordsman. In he went. And he taught people from their very experience, right there then, what the Buddha's message was, pointing to their greed, their attachment, their aversion, their jealousy. And often with great good humour, but it was very incisive and meaningful and unusual. He had many qualities and was really a very remarkable person. Some of you know that in England, I work in the prisons. I don't. People sometimes ask me, have I many followers? And I have to say, well, I do have some followers, but you often won't see them because most of them are locked up. I've been for 43 years now, going into the prisons in England and Wales and occasionally in Scotland. And there, of course, you're very conscious of how people have followed their defilements, how people have often, unfortunately, it's mostly the fifth precept that they've broken. These days I go on a lot about keeping the fifth precept, abstaining from alcohol and drugs, because a huge percentage of people in prison are there because they didn't observe that precept. And there they are, lives radically altered. And they can't remember what they did. They can't remember. They will say to me sometimes, they just can't remember killing the person they killed. They don't remember it. It's frightful. But going in those places, it's extraordinary. Sometimes someone will come up to me. And I've, of course, put many, many books around over the years in the prisons. And men read them and pass them on and leave them sometimes in their cell when they're moved to another jail. And then someone else finds that book in the cell. And occasionally someone will come up to me with one of the Ajahn Chah books and say, God, this is fantastic. And they have no idea about my connection with Luang Por Chah, but they've just read a few words, in translation, of course, in English, of what he taught. There's one man I see who has been in prison now for a very long time. He's a very well-known, he was an armed robber. And he has enormous devotion to Luang Por Chah. I gave him quite a thick book, one of the few that's been published commercially, of Luang Por Chah's talks. He read the whole thing, cover to cover, 3 times off, straight off. So impressed. And this is a man who, has a background in violence, was using drugs and alcohol and all that previously. And he's read that book and it's changed his life. So in many respects, in many ways, Luang Por Chah, coming from this very simple background, has had an enormous impact. It's a real gift. And he was such an inspiration. Just seeing him there in that kuti. Every time I come to Wat Pa Pong, I go to his old kuti. For me, that's the sort of almost the most meaningful place here. Because during his lifetime, that was the kind of heart of Wat Pa Pong. That was the powerhouse. That's where he sat. That's where things happened. And whatever we were doing, whether we were drawing water or whatever business we might have going across the temple, we'd always keep an eye on what was going on at Luang Por Chah's kuti. And sometimes there'd be a gathering, a sort of spontaneous gathering, and we'd go and join it. That's where it all happened. And I often think about it, and when I come here, I always go there. And seeing him just offering himself in that way to people who were coming here has been a tremendous inspiration. And in what I do, I don't, of course, by comparison, do anything very much really at all. But what I do with the prisons, just going to the prisons, I go to prisons 3 days a week. I sometimes go to 4 or 5 jails in 1 week. And going into those places and talking to people and doing what I can to offer Buddha's teachings, I think about how Luang Por Chah gave himself. He didn't hold back. Even when he was unwell, even when he had malaria, he sat there receiving people. So I should always be grateful to him. You have to be grateful to your teachers, They teach you things that you didn't know, and you always have benefited by that. In England now, one of the men who taught me when I was at drama school, he's 90. I always go and see him when I'm in London if I possibly can. I benefited from him. He taught me things that I didn't know. What he taught me paved the way for all that I've done here and done since. And so I am grateful for that. And here, of course, coming back, I come back every year. I determined a long time ago that if I possibly could, I would come to these gatherings. Not much, really, to do. Come on an aeroplane, come here, spend a bit of time here. It's the least I can do, just to honour the gift that I was given by Luang Por Chah and by all of you, by the people of this area of Ubon, who cared for me and fed me and gave me this opportunity. So I always would like to say thank you to you for welcoming us, Prat Pharang, enabling us to be here and to benefit from Luang Por Chah and the Buddha's teaching. So I won't go on too long because I don't know. Most of you can't understand a word I'm saying. So anyway, thank you very much for sitting and listening to me, and my very best wishes to you all. My anumodana and
สาธุทุกเข่าขึ้นเตรียมตัวกราบหลวงพ่อกราบ หวังว่าคงจะตั้งสติกันดีทุกคนนะ คนไทยเราส่วนญาติโยมที่เป็นชาวต่างประเทศก็ฟังรู้เรื่องดีต่อไปก่อนจะได้รับฟังองค์ต่อไปก็ขอประกาศไปหาโยมวิภาดาสุขปานนท์